if you go to the DURAN, you will see that we did a massive live stream there, Alex Christoforou and I, joined by the invaluable and wonderful Gonzalo Lira, who is in Ukraine itself and is providing us with his own exceptional insights about various aspects of this crisis. And we discussed the economic picture extensively. And I won't go over all the various things that I said there or in my previous program about the way in which the West seems to have underestimated the economic effects of this crisis and of the sanctions war that it has launched against the Russians. But today in Europe, I began to get the first sense that there are now growing doubts and growing concern that things have gone altogether too far and that the thing may be spiraling out of control in ways that are going to do serious damage to the European economy. Over the last few days, as is well known, there have been various political leaders in the United States, notably Nancy Pelosi, but other leaders as well in Congress, who have been agitating for a US ban on imports of oil from Russia. The United States doesn't import a huge amount of oil from Russia, but it does import some, and the amount of oil it's been importing from Russia has been growing because Urals crude, which is one of the many types of oil that Russia produces. I should say I'm not a geologist or an oil engineer, so I'm not by any means an expert on this topic. But I understand that Urals crude is what is called in the industry a heavy crude, and it is replacing, the United States has been buying Urals crude to buy the heavy crude that it used to import from Venezuela, which is, of course, another country upon which the United States has imposed sanctions. And though the quantities are not large, they are significant, and this would be a difficult type of crude oil, apparently, to replace. Nonetheless, the United States has been talking about doing so, and this has, I think, spooked further energy markets, especially oil markets. And adding fuel to the flames, if I can put it like this, was an extraordinary interview that Secretary of State Blinken gave to the US media, in which he said that the United States is actively considering imposing a block on imports of Russian crude oil, but that it was in discussions with its European allies about this, that no decision had been made because this would have to be a collective decision made by the collective West. And that had a shock effect on oil prices around the world, indeed on energy prices in general. And this, of course, is part of the immense price and oil supply and energy shock that we're already going to see anyway. But that was what Blinken said. And as I said, it's already had a dramatic effect on fuel prices, including, by the way, in the United States itself. Now, what I understand is that though Blinken said that this was in discussion with the Europeans were astonished by this because there had, in fact, been no substantive discussions about imposing an import ban on Russian crude oil. And on the contrary, some European governments have been trying to persuade some of their oil majors to resume purchases of Russian crude, which, by the way, accounts for around a quarter of the European oil market. And recently, Shell did, in fact, buy a certain amount of Russian crude oil. It came in for an incredible amount of abuse for doing so. It published an apology saying that it had been in consultation with governments about this. I understand that it actually bought that crude oil at the urging of certain governments, which are becoming increasingly alarmed about the state of affairs in the world energy markets. And here we see, by the way, the folly that the Europeans have led themselves into, because they should have realized as soon as they took that decision just over a week ago to disconnect certain key Russian banks from SWIFT, and also to impose sanctions on Russia's central bank, that market traders around the world would interpret these extraordinary moves as presaging a sustained all-out attack on the Russian economy. And that inevitably made businesses, oil companies, shipping lines, all of those people avoid trading in Russian oil and gas, even though the Europeans had said to the Americans that they didn't want there to be any restrictions on trade in Russian oil and gas. It shows again how the Europeans simply didn't understand the effect of what they were going to do on world energy markets. Anyway, after Blinken's comments, we started to get pushback from Germany, and by the way, also from Hungary, with the Germans and the Hungarians and apparently some of the others saying that this was not something that they were looking to do at the present time, that they were not going to impose any restrictions on imports of Russian oil. The trouble is, a few weeks ago, they were saying the same thing about SWIFT. They were also saying at that time that they would not agree to a disconnection of Russian banks from SWIFT, from the SWIFT interbank messaging system, because of the effect that would have on the European and global economies. And yet, nonetheless, and suddenly, without much prior discussion, without much prior warning, without apparently the European Central Bank being consulted, without the European banks being consulted either, the European government suddenly caved and agreed to that very thing. They agreed to disconnect not all Russian banks, but around 30% of the Russian banking system from SWIFT. So, when oil traders and shipping companies today see the Germans and people like other European countries saying that this is not on the agenda at the moment, they assume that it is. They say to themselves, well, that's exactly what the Europeans said about disconnecting from SWIFT. We don't really trust the Europeans, and for that reason, we're not going to buy Russian oil and at the moment, and we're not going to supply it to European customers. And this is creating an incredibly stressed atmosphere in world energy markets. It turns out that the Saudis have rejected requests for them to increase oil production. The US has been desperately talking to countries like Iran and incredibly Venezuela about sourcing alternative oil supplies from these countries. To my mind, that is very much an act of desperation. But the thing that needs to be done at this time, which is for a authoritative statement to be made from Western governments, including, by the way, from the government of the United States, that trade in Russian oil products is not threatened by sanctions, and that Western governments are anxious to see stability restored to world energy markets. They are not doing that. Now, most Russian oil, I understand, is actually transported on Russian ships, and there's apparently lots of Russian tankers with oil circling the globe, looking to discharge their cargoes in various places. Likelihood is that they will all eventually end up in Asia. Perhaps some of them will even return to Russia. But at the moment, The reality is that this absolutely centrally important trade in Russian oil stands frozen. And this is causing energy prices to spike. And of course, it's also having a knock-on effect on other prices as well. And it's also now starting to have a particularly savage impact on the European economy. Well, we shall see what happens. We shall see if finally somebody has the courage to stand up and say that this policy is absurd, it's ridiculous, it may succeed in creating an economic recession in Russia. But the Russians, of course, on an issue like Ukraine, are undoubtedly willing to pay the price of such a recession. But the point is, it's going to create a recession crisis in Europe, and eventually and inevitably that will feed through to the United States as well. If you wanted to see incompetent leadership in action, leadership which is driven by emotion, by Twitter almost, by what goes on in the Twitter sphere, and which perhaps spends more time worrying about what Twitter is saying than about what the technical experts in the European Central Bank and in the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Board now having confirmed that it was not consulted about either the SWIFT disconnection or about the sanctions on the Russian Central Bank. If you want to see policy made on the hoof by people who are far more frightened of what Twitter and some journalists might say about them than about what the technical experts are telling them, what is happening across the European and world economies, well, you couldn't do better than look at the situation in the world that we see today. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about that. It's the first doubts, the first fears, but it's not clear at the moment that these have crystallized to the point that we're going to see a major reverse. I'm going to make one further observation. If we do see a major reverse, if a final decision is made to stop where we've come to make it clear that world oil markets are not going to be affected, the trade in Russian oil is categorically excluded from sanctions, and that there is no possibility of that changing. If we also start to see steps being taken to restore some kind of order to world food prices and to prices in commodities, then some of the harm that's been done over the last couple of weeks will be mitigated. But if not, then as I said, we're looking at a very, very severe recession. Now, given how difficult the situation is, you would have thought that the Europeans and the Americans would be trying to facilitate a settlement of the Ukraine issue. Now, to remind ourselves of a fact which far too few people want to talk about, the reason we are in this crisis is because NATO refuses to retract its decision to offer Ukraine membership of NATO, which it made back in 2008, and it refuses to support the demands that the Russians have made that Ukraine fully implement the Minsk agreement. And that is why we are in this crisis, which, given how severe this crisis is turning out, seems astonishing that we should have got ourselves into this situation over things like that. But anyway, putting that aside, you would have thought that having learnt the lesson that intransigence creates disaster, you would have thought that by now, at least, we would start to see some action on the part of Western governments to try to turn things round, to try to help these negotiations that are going on between Russia and Ukraine crystallize and reach some kind of a settlement. And the Russians have made fairly clear what the terms that they're looking for are. They want Ukraine to commit to neutrality, to shape its constitution on that basis. They want Ukraine to recognize that the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are independent of Ukraine, and that Crimea has left Ukraine forever and united with Russia. And they want the demilitarization of Ukraine. And contrary to what some people are saying, they are still insisting on the cleansing of Ukraine of various far-right movements and the militias that they've established. Now, I don't see anything in these demands that the Russians are making that ought to create severe or particular problems for the West. It would certainly be embarrassing and difficult, but it would be a solution. And I don't think the Russians are going to retreat from these demands. But Western powers, again, just as they failed to persuade Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement, which would have left Ukraine in a far better situation than the one it now faces, just as they're not prepared to weren't prepared to urge the Ukrainians to implement the Minsk agreement, they don't seem to be taking any step at all to try to find some kind of political solution to this crisis, which would reflect the terms that the Russians have made out. So at the moment, all we're getting is this argument between the Ukrainians and the Russians about humanitarian corridors. Now, I've explained all this in previous videos. This is taken directly out of the textbook of what the Russians did in Syria. They're trying to establish humanitarian corridors in the leading cities with the aim that civilians can leave them, but eventually so can Ukrainian troops also. So far, these humanitarian corridors are not operating. That was, again, very much the pattern of what happened in Syria. But eventually in Syria, as the position of the anti-Assad fighters there became untenable, they did eventually accept the demands that the Russians had made. They did work on the basis of these corridors, and that did mean laying down their arms and being evacuated to safe areas. So one mustn't assume that that isn't happening. But alongside all these discussions about humanitarian corridors, the blocking of the Ukrainian army in Donbass is tightening. And I've been getting reports that over the last couple of hours, there's been a major battle in a Ukrainian town called Izium, which is apparently in this part of the Donbass, and apparently, or so I'm told, this has tightened the net around the main Ukrainian military force, which is still operating in the Donbass. Now, obviously, I can't confirm this. This is based very much on Russian sources. I'm not assuming that what they say is true, but if it is true, then the military force, the major part of the Ukrainian army, which is still concentrated in the Donbass, the part of the Ukrainian army which still contains its best troops, its position is starting to look increasingly untenable. And this is happening also at the same time that the situation in Mariupol is becoming ever more difficult for the Ukrainian forces which are bottled up there. So it could very well be that over the next couple of days we will see some kind of collapse in the Donbass, in Mariupol, and on the part of this military grouping, in which case perhaps the Ukrainians will change their position. Anyway, that seems to me to be the situation on the military front. Now, there's also been something else, which is that there's been a major press conference in Beijing by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Now, I should say this is a major event, and I'm going to cover it fully when the Chinese Foreign Ministry publishes a proper readout. which they haven't done at the moment. But he has been talking about certain things, and that at which the rest of the Chinese media has been discussing. And this is what China Daily said that he had to say about China's relationship with Russia. And China Daily reports him saying, Foreign Minister affirms importance of China-Russia friendship. And it says that State Council and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said on Monday, no matter how precarious and challenging the international situation may be, China and Russia will maintain strategic focus and steadily advance their comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. Speaking at a press conference on the sidelines of the fifth session of the 13th National People's Congress in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, Wang said the China-Russia relationship not only benefits their people but also helps world peace, stability and development. Wang said the China-Russia relationship is valued for its independence. It is based on non-alliance, non-confrontation and non-targeting of any third party, and it is free from interference or discord sown by third parties. The friendship between the Chinese and Russian people is rock solid, and there is a bright prospect for bilateral cooperation. Well, all of that suggests, and clearly is intended to show, that the Chinese-Russian relationship remains solid. Now, that brings me to a further point, which is I discussed yesterday, this partial disconnection of Russian banking system from the Visa and MasterCard systems. I explained in my previous video that this only applies to banks, to cards issued outside Russia by which cannot now work in Russia, and it also means that Visa and MasterCards which have been issued by Russian banks in Russia cannot work outside Russia. But Visa and MasterCards issued by Russian banks within Russia can still work in Russia. Well, over the course of the last 24 hours, after that announcement, there's been a massive rollout, apparently, in Russia of Russian banks issuing new cards to customers which connect them to the Mir payment card system, which is the Russian payment card system, separate from Visa and MasterCard, but also, and most importantly, to the Chinese Union Pay system, which is enormous. I've traveled in Asia and I've seen it accepted practically everywhere in Asia. So that suggests that this has been in preparation for some time. It is another move, in other words, for the Chinese and the Russians to continue the task of integrating their economies. And I understand that Chinese-Russian trade in January, February hit record levels and apparently is continuing to grow. So what we see is that rapid reorientation of the Russian economy from its Western links with the West towards China. It's continuing. In some respects, it's accelerating. That doesn't in any way affect the fact that the Russia will go through a period of high economic turbulence over the next few months. But once this process is done, we will see the Russians integrated with the Chinese economic system. Apparently, Turkey is now also floating the idea of transferring trade with Russia to rubles and lira, in other words, to local currencies. Once all of that is done, I have to say, being realistic about it, there will be a much more stable trading partnership than the one that Russia has repeatedly tried and failed to forge with the nations of the West. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the current situation today. We'll see whether these negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians go anywhere. The word is that the Ukrainians are floating the possibility of embracing some kind of neutral status. I don't think the Russians take those kind of assurances seriously. It doesn't seem as if the Ukrainians really have any intention of doing that. But that seems to me the situation. Negotiations going on in Belarus, more